the round has begun. I would like the motion is this House would ban the need to take a graduate level standardized examination in order to qualify for graduate school, which is the MCAT, LSAT, GMAT, GRE, any graduate level standardized exam. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to start out the top half of the debate. Here.
Here. Panel. In the world of today's education at the graduate level, the primary indicator of someone's ability to succeed in graduate level programs has become the graduate level standardized exam. Most people see how well you're going to be as a doctor and how well you do on the MCAT, right? How well you're doing in school. As a lawyer, most people think how well you're going to do in law school comes from how well you do on the LSAT, right? The fundamental idea that these exams are a good indicator of how well you're going to do in these programs is inherently false just simply because there's a wider range of criteria behind how well someone can do in such programs. And I, as part of Prime Minister, will break that down. But first, when it comes to the resolution banning all graduate level standardized exams, MCAT, LSAT, GRE, etc., and any points of clarification? No? Okay, cool. So since that's the case, I'd like to move into the first constructive point that we have as opening government. The idea that we already have other factors that can be good indicators of how well people do in these programs, right? So as opening government, we want to weigh this round based on how can we benefit the education and raise the matriculation of people in the program and how likely they are to stay in the program and so on, right? So we will do that by showing that insofar as like we on our side of the house we have the better education that we should win this round today, right? Based on that principle, based on that idea, opposition has to show you how in their world where people do take these exams, you have a better applicant that can stay and do better in these programs, right? So they have to show you why uniquely these exams, other than criteria such as your GPA, such as your extracurricular activities, such as your volunteering, such as your internship, is uniquely worse than these standardized exams, right? They have to show you why things like the MCAT are better than all these other criteria that medical schools can use to judge you as an applicant, right? So this comes to the factor that opposition, I think, insofar as they do not prove the point that these standardized exams can show how good of an applicant you are, they do not win this round today, right? That leads me into the second major constructive point and principal argumentation of opening government. We believe that the major principle of this round is the accessibility to doing well in these standardized exams, right? So if we look at the state of how things are going today, we can see that people who have like greater connection to someone who's like a Kaplan brand ambassador and can give them like course codes and course discounts are going to do better on these exams just simply because they have a connection, right? We can see people who have more money and a higher income can have like the ability to afford these programs, such as Kaplan, such as Princeton, or afford review materials, afford like more practice exams to do better, right? We can see people who are like predisposed to fields such as medicine or law are going to have a better chance of doing better on these exams because they know more about them. For example, like if let's say my dad's a doctor, right? My dad's going to be able to provide me more information about how to take the MCAT, or if my dad's a lawyer, he's going to be able to provide me more information on how to take the LSAT, as opposed to someone who doesn't have a medical professional or a lawyer in their family, right? So we can see that within the status quo, there are systematic like barriers in place for people who do not have access to money to like review resources or information to do well on these exams, right? Since that is the case, there is a fundamental understanding that these exams do not entirely show how good of an applicant or how good of a critical thinker you can be in, let's say, these programs, right? So, this accessibility is a major problem here. Like these exams don't really show how good of a critical thinker you are. They show how much accessibility you have to materials ahead of time, right? Since that's the case, if we remove these standardized exams to get into these graduate level programs, we can see that this barrier to information and this barrier and deterrence to entering like fields like medicine and law are removed, right? What does that mean? What does that mean? Like people who can like have a better chance of like succeeding in these programs have a higher chance of getting into these programs in the first place because they're not being judged by an arbitrary exam that doesn't necessarily show their qualifications as someone who can get into these schools. So why does this matter? What is the impact of this, right? So we can see that people who get into these programs aren't just simply based on one particular metric or one particular exam, which is particularly arbitrary, right? That means people who get into these graduate level programs are people that aren't like particularly deterred by how much money they have to get into these programs. That means we have a better applicant pool that's not just in these programs simply because they have a greater access to knowledge and greater access to resources. These are people who are going to be more likely to want to stay in these programs and do better before time. So we show that on our side of the house that people that get into these programs aren't particularly deterred by these exams, and the people who get into these programs are going to be more likely to stay there simply because not because they did well on an exam and they were able to get into a program. So what does opening government show you thus far?
It's got really loud.
Yeah. So what does opening government show you thus far? We show you that opposition has to prove how these standardized exams can uniquely provide greater level of criteria and judgment than other things that already exist, such as GPA. Right? Insofar as they don't do that, government wins. And I've also showed the harms of these standardized exams just simply through the fact that they are not a particular judge of knowledge or critical thinking. They're judges of how much access you have to the materials ahead of time, right? They allow for worse applicants to get through to the graduate level program. And with that, I am proud to propose.
Here. Thank your speaker for his speech.
Yeah, we're
recording half right now. So
yeah, we're recording, so you can catch it.
Should I listen to the first speech while the second speech is going on? Who's the second speech? Sorry, I'm insulting over that. No, I didn't mean that. It was a Paul.
Yeah, my mouth got really dry halfway through my speech.
Bring water bottles and bread. So we can do that.
Guys, wait a second.
Yeah.
Wait a second.
You know the resolution, right? Good?
Yeah, something about requirements for standardized test requirements for graduate level.
It's written.
Graduate entry.
OG is me and Navin, and OO is Fred and Dave.
Yeah,
I almost had a Marco Rubio moment. I was like about to run for my water
No,
bottle.
because after I'm done, like I don't need to write any more stuff. Do you want me to stand like in front of them?
Yeah, if you can.
You want to record yourself?
No, it's only running.
Oh. Everyone ready?
Panel, I'm here today to break down the arguments that opening government just made and then provide 4 extremely compelling reasons why opposition has the more compelling case. So the first topic that I want to hit on is that Navin said that without standardized testing, students are more likely to stay in programs and there's less dropout rate from programs. This actually doesn't make any sense because these standardized tests, they help show who has higher level critical thinking, which is the number one determining factor of if you can make it through these programs. Navin said that critical thinking is not evaluated in these standardized tests, but numerous studies since the 1970s show that there's a direct correlation between critical thinking skills and standardized testing.
Out of order.
So, 1 minute.
And then the second point is that Navin said there's accessibility issues where there's not an even playing field. Because if you're rich, you can do better. However, this is not really a factor because there are numerous free resources that, like Khan Academy, that I've personally used that are very, very well written and just as good as the resources that cost money. Additionally, there are fee waivers for applications. There are test waivers. There's many ways to take these tests when you're in a financial situation. Additionally, we can argue that these tests actually level the playing field between students of different socioeconomic backgrounds because coming from McCUNY, we are always going to be looked down upon by students in Harvard. However, when we take the MCAT, the LSAT, the GRE, we're at the same playing field. The score is the only thing that matters. Our background does not matter. It does not matter where we spent our 4 years. It matters after these 4 years when we take this test, what did we get the results from? And now I want to go into my 4 points.
So does your socioeconomic background not affect how well you do on the exam? For example, if I'm poor and I have to work a full-time job while studying for the exam, does that not affect what my grade is?
Yeah, so there is an effect. However, the effect is not large because of these free resources. There are ways to get around it. The way that it was presented was that this is it's black and white. If you're poor, you can't do as well as someone who's rich. That's not the case. It depends where you find your resources and how you use them. So the first point is that the standardized testing, it weeds out students. It's impossible to go and judge millions of students who apply to certain programs. It's very efficient and it's just practical to have a method to be able to show these students are ones that we should consider, others we can't. And even if these tests are good at weeding people out because they show how much you care about the test. But Navin might argue that these tests don't show anything, but it shows your effort and your commitment to what you want to do. It shows your passion. Someone who claims, oh, this test means nothing, and they only studied 1 hour, they did bad. But if you really care about being a doctor, you'll put in 40 hours a week to study, and as a result, your grade will be better. The next point I want to make is that standardized testing is the most fair form of testing. In our normal classes, we all know those people that after class every day, they run to the teacher and buddy up with the teacher. And then they go to every office hour where they basically, before they take the test, they already know what's going to be on the test. On the standardized testing, however, there's no advantage that you can get from any connections. There's no way to change your outcome based off your relationships. After my point. And there's no way, every single testing is the same. I went in to take the MCAT, they fingerprinted me. There's no way to cheat. It's impossible to cheat on standardized testing. And the testing environment is the same. You won't have a fire alarm going off here. You won't have someone coughing out, whatever. It'll be the same testing environment. You'll know what to expect. And that goes into, actually, Josiah, you have a point?
So is it really fair when you have thousands of dollars that you can use to gain thousands of different test bank questions that allow you to do better on these standardized exams when other people who are poor won't get those free resources from Khan Academy, etc.?
Yeah. So those test bank questions, they can be helpful, but it really just depends how you use it. They're not essential to your success, but when you have so many free resources you can't even finish the amount of free resources that there are, those are sufficient. Lastly, I want to say that these tests are actually the most easy to study for because based off of the resources that you use, you'll have a good idea of what to expect. There's not going to be a curveball where the teacher puts something on the test that they never mentioned in class, or you feel something was unfair. You actually know exactly what to expect several months before you even come into the test. And as a result, it makes it very easy to study for, as opposed to other classes and tests that we have taken in the past. And lastly, the government, they presented the idea that standardized testing doesn't matter, but they didn't really give any alternative to what would be a better method. The method we have is great. They said we need to look at the whole package, but that inevitably leads to bias. What does people think? Oh, this one experience was better than the other experience. This is valued more than something else. This is something that's pretty black and white, where your score reflects your passion, it reflects your critical thinking knowledge, it reflects something that cannot be biased. And as a result, we're proud to say that standardized testing should remain and play a vital factor into your admissions into grad schools.
Okay. I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver his speech for no longer than 7 minutes and 15 seconds.
We prefer gender-neutral pronouns here.
I like to be known as they.
Is that an equity violation?
What happened to all the Vancouver people? They all left.
They did one tournament, they're like, nah, never again.
Finals.
It's already finals?
Yeah.
I mean,
Like,
Well,
we-
two are
yeah.
preparing.
Yeah.
Or they're studying for standardized tests. Ready? Steady?
Adjudicators, we live in a world filled with current oppressive and systemic discrimination to many marginalized members of society. This has been seen evidently in cases of like Harvard, where like Asian students are suing Harvard for discrimination against them in their graduate level or undergraduate level admissions. We see this in the case of like black students who may be given like, I don't know, some type of preferential treatment when it comes to admissions to some schools just because of their color or race. We see that the whole education system as a whole is currently going through this transformative phase of really understanding what factors should we really consider when it comes to the idea of admissions, right? With this contextual analysis in mind, opening government wants to come up here and tell you that in this current world that we live in, where we're analyzing what factors do we really need to look for in students, we should not be advocating for standardized exams to be the sole factor with how students gain access to such things as medical schools or law schools or business schools, etc., etc. Now, we did a great job here coming up here and telling you that our principle that we stand for is accessibility. And in so far that the opening opposition team does not provide a counter-analysis of how exactly they're gaining or providing the same amount of accessibility even without this, with this policy, they're not really doing their job, right? Insofar as we've seen many representations through studies by independent institutions that the MCAT is inherently providing bias against poor and marginalized members of society, we can see that our case still stands strong, right? So first off, I want to give some rebuttal to what Fred came up here and told you, give some recrystallization to what points we made, and then provide some off-case analysis as well. First off, we see Fred comes up here and tells you that these exams provide critical skills or critical understanding that all applicants need for their respective graduate schools, right? We believe that this is pedagogically false, right? In the sense of the true value of what you're gaining from that standardized exam is not whether or not you could be a better doctor, it's whether or not you could be the doctor that they want you to be, right? Or they could the applicant that they want you to be, right? It's not really providing the best analysis of what exactly we look for in doctors, right? I know many students who take the MCAT who gain very high scores in the MCAT and then don't get into medical school, or if they do get into medical school, they drop out within a year or 2 years because they realize that this exam didn't really expose them to what it really means to be a doctor, right? Insofar as the MCAT, the GRE, the LSATs don't provide skills for how to have a conversation with a person in a disenfranchised community, or how to have conversations with people who are marginalized or minoritized in society, or how to deal with people who are on death row. How do you get them out of that situation? The LSAT doesn't really test you in a very coherent way to provide you you those critical skills, right? They only provide you the skills of reading like paragraphs upon paragraphs of information with like a rudimentary time scale that you've practiced for many, many months, right? What we tell you these exams are instead doing is providing doctors and lawyers who believe that this is what the real field will look like too, right? These are doctors who, like as Fred said, right, the exam is quite easy to understand, right? It's quite repetitive sometimes, or even easy to kind of just dupe the system or find a loophole in the system and just do what you need to do to get by, right? But we believe this is not giving you a better doctor as a whole, right? Because now when these doctors leave these graduate schools or enter into graduate school and start clinical practice, they don't get easy rudimentary cases on a daily basis, right? Like a law student doesn't get that, like the time to just sit there and read and analyze a whole 6 paragraphs within 15 minutes. Instead, he may be going through a whole caseload of work within 15 minutes, right? Like these exams are not really preparing students. Instead, they're just giving a sugar-coated euphemism version of what exactly graduate schools are. And how does this affect us, right? We tell you that insofar as they're not providing better graduates as a whole to impact the world as a whole, this policy should not be followed. In addition, we also tell you that this is going to lead to less matriculation, right? Like meaning students are more likely to drop out because they were kind of duped in a sense of what they were getting into, right? Just because they did good on the MCAT doesn't mean that they're really going to be good in graduate school. Secondly, they told you that accessibility is really not an issue because you have free resources like Khan Academy and that you have fee waivers, right? We tell you that this is completely false. Insofar as the Khan Academy is providing you maybe content review, they're not providing you the wealth of knowledge that you gain from Kaplan and Princeton review through practice questions, right? For a lot of these exams, many of it, as Fred said, is rudimentary because you're getting analysis through the repetitive nature of the stem of the question, right? Like ideas of oh, it's an inference question. Insofar as they don't have access to inference questions to test and practice with, they're not really gaining the access or the benefits of Khan Academy because all Khan Academy really does is content review, not practice questions and the plethora of different types of questions that can be provided from these oligopolies as a whole, which I'll get to. Then the fee waivers issue, right? Fee waivers, sure, in general, they sound like the greatest idea, but they don't really cover the middle class poor that is actually trying to gain access, right? They may help the extremely poor, but they don't help the middle class poor, right? The same idea is kind of used with the whole Excelsior scholarship idea, right? Where they're like, oh my God, look, see, there's a way for poor people to gain access to college. But insofar as there's only 2% of the population gaining access to this scholarship, it's not really a benefit on their side of the house, right? It's not really providing access to everyone. It's just providing access to the really, really poor, right? You're still leaving out a whole group of people who may not be really, really poor, but are still not rich enough to actually gain access to what Kaplan or Princeton Review might offer, right? With that in mind, we go into this idea of the main point, right? The first point that was coming out of opening opposition is this idea that it weeds out students, and the second point was this idea that it's the fairest form of testing, right? In both sense, we feel like those points fail. First off, it doesn't really weed out students who are intellectual, right? It weeds out students who just can't afford to take the exam. That's what we feel like it weeds out. It's no guarantee that these students are actually going to be smart, or that they're actually going to stay in the program, or that they're actually going to be, better doctors in the future, right? It just shows you who had money to gain access to the resources, to take the exam, to pass the exam, get into graduate school, and stay in graduate school. That's literally all it's testing, not really whether or not they'll be able to stay in the graduate school in the long term, or whether or not they'll be better doctors. Secondly, it's not the most fair thing because, again, with research shown by private institutions, we've seen that there's inherently a big discrimination against people that are poor. And then lastly, it's not an easy test to study for, again, because you have the resources that you can do, and insofar as you don't have the resources for poor people, it's not really going to be a good case. So with the last couple of seconds that I have, I want to give you a really quick off-case point, right? It's kind of inherently understood here, right? The idea that this idea of a standardized exam for graduate schools feeds the formation of oligopolies, right? Why are oligopolies bad? Because they're first held on a for-profit model, right? Insofar as they're going to be for-profit, we cannot guarantee that the resources they give will actually be efficient for the student to actually get into the graduate school, right? They may just be giving you offers or plans just to incentivize you to pay in to the program without giving you the actual benefits or the real royalties of what you're supposed to get. Secondly, it hurts small startup businesses, right? Because now small companies that are trying to be tutors, small companies that are trying to get into this market of providing real help for students may not be able to get to because they're being bullied out by companies like Kaplan and Princeton who literally have a hand in every single sector of the business. And lastly, it doesn't guarantee that these students will be more trained, right? So what did we come here and give you in opening government? We first off gave you the accessibility argument, which is a principled argument that still hasn't been hit by opening opposition. And we've given you 3 solid points that still stand, that it doesn't show you that you're a better applicant. It's still standardized exams that are only by criteria. And lastly, because it forms a stronger oligopoly that should not be considered in this debate. Thank you.
Here, here.
That's a terrible time.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to deliver a speech to not exceed 7 minutes and 15 seconds. You're here.
I just want to get right into it. So Navin came up here and presented the opening government's argument by saying standardized tests are the primary indicator of ability, right? And our job as opposition is to tell you why they should be the primary indicator of prospective students. But our job as opening opposition is not to tell you how somehow standardized tests trump all other indicators. We're telling you why standardized tests are somehow a little bit effective. We're not saying that they have to be the overarching idea of how a student should be or should not be accepted into school. We're telling you how somehow this offers a better opportunity for schools to accept or decline prospective students. So coming into this, my first thing I want to come into this is by saying we can't compare apples to oranges, right? A kid from Harvard, a kid from community college, there's no really benchmark indicator to compare these students, right? The first thing they come up here and tell you that, people who are just richer have better opportunities, they'll do better on these exams, and people who are poorer, they'll do worse on the exams. I think the misguided understanding of this is if we get rid of standardized tests, the rich are still rich, the poor are still poor. Those rich people are still going to be accepted into research labs because they have the money, they have the connections. Those rich people are still going to have the ability to do good in the faster they do because they have the money to get the test banks they need, and the poor people will just not have those abilities. So by saying that, by getting rid of these exams, we're somehow enabling those people to get, we're enabling those poor people to get those opportunities, and somehow, I just want to address that point. So the second thing Navin came up here and said was, there's systematic barriers that hinder people taking these exams, right? And conversely, in government's world, somehow they believe that without these exams, everyone is equally qualified and given an equal chance, right? So in our world, we're saying that, like, by giving these exams, as Fred has come up here and said, we're offering a benchmark indicator, right? We can compare apples to oranges because we're giving everybody a fair chance and equal opportunity to do good in these tests. And Josiah came up here and also told you that he first started his argument by saying, standardized tests are unfair because minorities and people who are poor are somehow given an advantage. But then by the end of his argument, he tells you that, the minorities and the poor people that are given that advantage are also discriminated against, which I feel is there's a contradiction in his argument that somehow, he said that, the minorities that are taking these exams, somehow, like, they'll get a better chance of getting to these schools, but they're also being discriminated against because they don't have enough money to take these exams. So, like I said earlier, we're not supporting that standardized exams are like the overarching factor of how students should be accepted in schools. We're telling you how they somehow provide some sort of effectiveness to allow colleges and institutions to be able to give a benchmark indicator of how good a student is. I'll take your POI.
So is it really a benchmark criteria when many people who do really, really well on the MCAT still don't get into medical school, right? The idea is that, like, the full picture or the holistic view is still better. So insofar as you're just adding an external variable that doesn't really provide any benefits, it's just going to be more of a deterrent than it is a benefactor in any way.
Like you brought up in your argument, people who got the 99th percentile in these exams still haven't gotten to schools, right? So the fact that these exams are put in place and people who do extremely good in them still aren't getting to the schools opens up the idea that these schools aren't actually looking at the standardized exams as the overarching factor of how these students are being chosen. It's a part of how students are being chosen, right? So even as they said, these students have been doing amazing on their exams, it doesn't mean they're exactly going to get into these schools. So it's showing how, in our world, the opposition's world, that standardized exams aren't like this huge factor in how a school decides whether or not a student is, like, a prospective student is equipped to be in the school. It's a part of many different factors that allow them to be in the school. So I'd like to get into my points now. My first point is that, like I said earlier in my rebuttal, I brought up the point of how standardized exams set a bar to prospective students. What do I mean by bar? So I said earlier benchmark indicator, and I also said earlier about apples and oranges, right? Okay, well, to flesh out that point, I'm saying that by providing students with the exact same exams, no matter what school they went to or no matter where they're from, it allows schools to understand a student's evaluation and a school's evaluation, how well they've equipped their students, right? So I'll take your POI.
Yeah. So let's say we buy this argument that, like, MCAT is good or that the graduate school exams are good, right? Insofar as you can't prove that there's still equal accessibility between all marginalized members of society to gain access to this, like, criteria, you're still getting a net negative on your side of the house because people are still being stopped from going into that field because of this exam.
So in our opposition's world, we're saying that like, okay, taking the MCAT, it's not that difficult. I feel like they're saying that taking the MCAT or taking these standardized exams is so difficult for these families and students. But I feel as though taking these exams isn't that difficult. There's a lot of opportunities that schools give them, and the few waivers they talked about, it's not that small of an increment that they're like stopping these students from taking these exams. They're not that difficult, right? So, getting to my second point, what is the basis of decision making for a graduate school? Okay, so the basis of decision making for graduate school offers an equal playing field and platform for students, as I talked about earlier. And also, by banning an industry, they haven't talked about really the effects of banning such an industry. How big is the standardized testing industry as a whole, right? There are tutors, right? There are people that work second jobs to tutor kids about the MCAT because they know a lot about it. There are books that are being made, right? There's facilities and there's other things that are happening, right? So by banning such an industry, they haven't really talked about how this affects the scope of like the status quo, like who's working to create these exams, who's working to like get people better at them, right? And by just quickly banning them, we're kind of disenfranchising those people who work so hard to like teach people about the MCAT or tutor people about the MCAT or create books about the MCAT. Not at this time. So such a drastic decision has ripples on a lot of people. That's what I feel as though that hasn't really been talked about in this debate. That like getting rid of like standardized exams is really going to affect a lot of people. Just to flesh out my points again, our job as opening opposition isn't to tell you why standardized exams are the best thing about how a student should, or isn't. Our job isn't to tell you why standardized exams is a single factor that a student should be chosen into a school. It's part of many factors, right? Standardized exams allow us to compare apples to oranges, as I said, as people from different schools, different areas, and also with those other factors, where they've done work, where they volunteer, that comes into play and when they're being decided into a school, right? And I'm proud to oppose.
Daniel, I gotta be honest, you probably have the best speeches around.
That's a good speech. Gucci. All right, you guys want to take some time to talk and then?
Yeah.
You want to
Well, I can't make a full decision. I'll just go through that one.
Yeah.